Hello and welcome to episode 3 of Ask Dan, where I answer your photography questions. If you'd like to get a question in to be answered on a future episode, you can click the link in the description or leave a comment. If you're reading the comments and you see a question that you know the answer to, feel free to jump in and answer it yourself. Let's make this a community effort. I'm not always able to answer all the comments in a timely manner, and it may be a question that I don't know the answer to as well. So without further delay, let's jump right into episode 3 of Question number 1 comes from Lawrence of Boynton Beach, USA. I have a 1.4x teleconverter on my Fuji 70-300 and 100-400. What are the best ways to utilize this teleconverter shooting wildlife stationary and with movement and shooting landscapes? The Fuji teleconverters are amazing little pieces of gear, especially the 1.4x. I have the 1.4. I don't have the 2x, but I've been nothing but impressed with the 1.4. And honestly, I think it's an indispensable piece of gear if you have the 50-140 or the 100-400 or the new 70-300. It works with all three of those lenses, and it gives you an extended range with almost no loss in quality and speed. You do lose one stop of light, but that's not a deal breaker. Just crank the ISO dial up a little bit, you'll never notice. So to answer your question, using the 1.4x on one of those lenses, it's really a set it and forget about it type of thing. There's really not much to be concerned with. It just works. It gives you that extended range, and you really don't have to do anything to compensate. You just shoot what you see. And the one thing to keep in mind, and this is kind of true with all really long lenses, when you're zooming way out, especially in warmer weather, you can get heat shimmers because you're looking through all of that air and all that moisture and heat in the atmosphere. And so you'll see a definite loss of quality when you're shooting that far out, when you're shooting through a lot of atmosphere, or if you're shooting in haze or fog. Anytime when you're shooting through a lot of air, or a lot of atmosphere, you'll see a loss of sharpness. So that's really the only thing to be concerned with. Just put it on the lens, forget it's there, and just go do your thing. Question number 2. Ken from Long Beach wants to know about focus modes and when and how to use the various modes, and especially face and eye tracking. I did an entire video on the Fujifilm autofocus system, which you can find at this link here. So I won't repeat all that stuff. But one thing I didn't talk about in that video was the face tracking. So I'll touch a little bit on that now. So all the Fuji cameras have a face detection autofocus setting, which you'll find in the autofocus menu. First of all, you can turn the face detection on and off, and then you can choose between 4 different settings within the face detection system, and this has to do with its eye detection capabilities. And the choices are eye off, eye auto, right eye priority, left eye priority. I will say that Fuji's face detection autofocus works quite well, and here's an easy method you can use. If you shoot portraits or people on a regular basis, you might want to set a dedicated function button to face detection that'll toggle it on and off. In fact, you should check because your camera may already have a dedicated function button set to face detection. And so when you're shooting, you can quickly press the button and enable that detection, and it'll quickly grab the faces and the people when you're photographing. However, face detection can be fooled sometimes. It can grab the wrong faces, and I've seen it grab things that aren't faces, like trees. Trees have patterns in them in the bark that can fool face detection sometimes. So in those kind of situations, you'll want to turn the face detection off, so it doesn't get confused and throw off the focus. With the eye tracking feature, I generally leave mine set to eye auto, and that usually does a pretty good job. Again, if it's getting confused, you can turn that off. If you're shooting a specific angle on a person, and you definitely, maybe a very shallow depth of field, and you want a specific eye to be in focus all the time, that's when you might use the left and right eye priority settings. But for most situations, you'll probably want to leave the eye auto on and just toggle face detection on and off as needed. So I hope that answers your question. And again, check out my other video that fully explains all of the focus modes on the Fujifilm autofocus system. Question number 3. Keith Fincham from Brisbane, Australia. Is there a mathematical method to assist when deciding on the number of frames to shoot when using in-camera focus bracketing, and any guidance of setting up the start and end focus points in f-stop? The short answer is no. or at least I haven't discovered any mathematical formulas for this, and there are none published as far as I know. Fuji's menu for the focus bracketing is pretty limited, and on the newer cameras like the X-T4 and the X100V, you can actually set close focus and far focus points. But for the most part, it's a trial and error thing. With regards to how many frames to shoot when focus bracketing, I have generally gotten good results shooting about 50 frames. I guess you could go up to 100 frames if you wanted that extra detail, or if you're shooting a subject that spans a further distance between close and back focus. That's when you want to shoot more frames. But for a standard macro focus bracketing shot, I found about 50 frames seems to work pretty well. Now regarding what f-stop to use when doing focus bracketing, I think this is going to require some experimentation, because you will get some different looks when the photo is created and stacked when you use an extremely wide and extremely shallow apertures. And so I think in order to get the look that you want, you'll want to experiment. And generally when you're shooting focus bracketing, you're shooting still subjects, so you can afford to burn some frames and experiment. And it's pretty easy to shoot and just review your frames. When you're playing images back, you can hold the button left or right and you quickly scroll through the images so you can see the effect that your bracketing has when you're doing this. So that's a good way to gauge your progress and see how your test is going without needing to take the card out and go put it in the computer and do the actual bracketing. You can just quickly review the sequence of images and see how that looks. Question number 4. Doug from Australia asks, is Fuji going to improve the focus tracking on their cameras? My X-T30 has some deficiencies in this area when I use the 2x teleconverter and the 70 to 300mm lens. The short answer is yes. The Fujifilm engineers are always working on improving autofocus. And in fact, this area is one of their highest priorities when they're working on firmware updates. And so that brings another point. You should always make sure your camera has the latest firmware, because as new lenses come out, older cameras can be optimized through firmware updates to have better performance with the new lenses. So I obviously don't know what firmware your camera has right now, but one of the updates for the X-T30 did address exactly this, and they gave it increased autofocus performance and tracking. So again, always make sure your cameras have the latest firmware updates, because this is going to give them the highest performance and the best compatibility with the newest lenses. Next question. Chris from the UK asks, what is the best program to upload Fuji RAW files? So Chris, I'm not 100% sure what you mean by this. I'll try to address this the best I can. If you're simply referring to the fastest, most efficient way to upload your files from the card to the computer, you can just drag and drop the files from the card onto your computer, desktop, or whatever folder you want. Personally, I use a program called Photo Mechanic to import my camera files, my image files, and it does a very fast job, and it's also an incredibly quick image browser as well. I've done a couple of videos on my channel about Photo Mechanic, so you want to check those out. If you're talking about editing and processing Fuji RAW files, I actually answered this in episode 2, but I'll give you the answer here. Most of the programs that are out these days do a very good job. Capture One does a great job. DxO Photo Lab, the newest version is Photo Lab 5. That does an excellent job. Even Lightroom and Photoshop has been improved over the years to have better performance when processing the Fuji RAW files. Luminar is a good program. Really, any modern photo processing program is going to do a very good job with the Fuji RAW files. So it's really just a matter of preference and what program you enjoy using the most. Question number 6. Catherine from England asks, have you ever compared the Fuji 14 2.8 with the Fuji 16 2.8? I'd like to know your thoughts on these two lenses. Well, that's pretty good timing, Catherine, because I actually shot a review video of the 16 2.8 earlier today. That's actually now posted on my channel. So here's the link to that. But I'll give you my thoughts here as well. So I love the 14 2.8. I have no bad things to say about it, not one. It's an amazing lens. It's extremely sharp, fast autofocus, close focus. It's just a really wonderful wide-angle lens. If there's one downside that I've heard about the 14, I don't really worry too much about this, but it has a relatively loose aperture ring that you can easily bump. The Fuji 16mm 2.8, and I actually have one right here because I just finished shooting that video, it's smaller, lighter, and considerably less expensive than the 14 2.8, and it has closer focus. And it's weather sealed. So even though the 16 is not quite as wide as the 2.8, I think that 16 is a real sweet spot wide angle focal length. And I've shot a lot of stuff with this focal length over the years. As I pointed out in my review video, it gives me the very similar focal length view of what my old Nikon 24 2.8 did. And that was my all-time favorite wide-angle lens. That's what I cut my teeth on when I was a young budding adventure photographer. So I love the look that view angle gives. And so the 16 2.8 is very similar to that lens in that kind of respect. So between the two lenses, that's a tough one. The 14 is an incredible lens, but the 16 being weather sealed, smaller, lighter, less expensive, it's hard to beat. That's a really appealing combination. So if you can test one out, I would go get your hands on one because it really is a fantastic little lens, especially for the price. $399 versus $899. Next question. Mati from Estonia asks, what do you think of the Sony A7rm4 and the Sony 200-600 G OSS lens? So that's a little bit of a tricky question for me to answer, namely because I haven't shot any of the Sony cameras. I will say that Sony makes exceptionally good cameras, extremely high quality machines. They make sensors for a lot of other manufacturers. So the images that come out of Sony cameras they're great. The A7rm4, 61 megapixel camera with a stabilized sensor, you're going to get incredible images out of that camera. And I don't know anything about the 200-600, but I'm sure it's a great lens. Really, every camera on the market these days is going to make great photos. And the most important factor is which camera are you going to have the most fun using, that you're most comfortable with when you're holding it in your hands, looking through the viewfinder, navigating the menus, using the dials and the buttons on top. That's really what matters. Which one do you like better? So again, Sony A7R4, I'm sure it's a great camera. Haven't used it, so that's about as much as I can say. Hope that helps. Next question. Don from Chicago asks, could IR be added as a film sim on the Fujifilm cameras? Don, I have no idea if they could or if they will ever consider adding infrared profiles to the Fujifilm film simulation list. I do know that Fujifilm has two dedicated infrared cameras, the X-T1 IR and the new GFX 100 IR. In addition, there's some companies out there that can convert existing cameras to infrared, so you can find those on the web. But as to whether Fujifilm has any plans to add IR to the film sim list, that's certainly something I can ask the product managers next time I talk to them, see what they say. And last question in today's episode, Gloria from California asks, exactly how do the various in-camera options affect an image, like color chrome effect, color chrome FX blue, color dynamic range, and so on? So Gloria is referring to some of the creative settings that are found inside the X Series cameras. So I'll start with color chrome effect. Sometimes when you're shooting in very bright, high contrast scenes, so basically color chrome effect is designed to boost your colors in situations like this without overcooking them. The idea for this came from an actual Fujifilm film stock called Fortia, which was only sold for a couple of years during the mid-2000s in Japan. And the color profile of Fortia was that it promised even greater colors and contrast than Velvia, which is already a very high saturated Fujifilm. And so this color profile that Fortia had boosted certain colors without overloading the individual RGB channels in the film. And it addressed the issue that when you have too many colors that are saturated, the entire image can end up looking a little flat. So essentially, color chrome effect aims to increase and enhance the contrast of images that are already full of color. And it's a really subtle effect. So in the X Series cameras, you have two settings, weak and strong. And it's really best to just experiment and see what these do. Because again, they're really subtle, but they do make a difference. And Fuji has a second setting called Color Chrome FX Blue. And so this setting allows you to enhance those hidden blue colors even more, those blues that we see with our eyes, but the camera has a hard time picking them up because we see differently than the sensor. So Color FX Blue is just another way to enhance the blues in the sky and also in blue flowers and things like that. So the main difference between these two settings is that Color Chrome Effect, the regular setting, only affects yellows, oranges, reds, and greens, where Color Chrome FX Blue only affects the blue channel. So if you're shooting a landscape that has lots of greens and reds and yellows and oranges, you'd use Color Chrome Effect. If you want to enhance the blues of a scene, then use Color Chrome FX Blue. And you can certainly combine them. So you could use Color Chrome FX Blue to enhance the blues of your scene, and then use regular Color Chrome Effect to enhance those other colors. And you can do either of those as a weak or strong adjustment. So the best way to know is just to experiment and try them out with your scenes and see what you think. The Fuji cameras also have a setting called Color, and this merely affects the saturation of the scene. So if you want to boost the overall look of your scene and make it more saturated, you'll want to crank that up. And if you want to have a desaturated, more muted look to your scene, you can bring the color down. And keep in mind, this setting, as well as all the others I talked about, Color Chrome Effect, Color Chrome FX Blue, and the color setting, these only work with the Fuji JPEGs or the Fuji RAW files if you're using Fujifilm's X RAW Studio to process your RAW files. So that wraps up episode 3 of Ask Dan. I want to thank everybody who submitted questions this week. If you would like to get your questions in to be answered on a future episode, again, click the link in the description below. A lot of questions here pertaining to Fuji cameras. If you are a Fuji user, you'll definitely want to check out my best-selling ebook, X Series Unlimited. It's a 400-page guidebook that'll show you everything you need to know in order to get the best performance and have the most fun with your Fuji. Basically the missing manual for the X Series. So please subscribe to my channel, ring the bell so you'll be notified of future episodes, leave a comment. You can find me on social media and Patreon at Dan Bailey Photo, and you can follow my website and blog as well. So thanks again for watching. Have fun with your cameras out there, and I'll see you next time.